in the eyes, for instance, or rather in the mind. Gorgias appears to associate very closely, so closely, material and mental aspects, passivity and activity, to the point that it is difficult to separate them. I propose to examine briefly, very briefly, three aspects of the encomium that seem to imply a mimetic theory, namely the role played by identification, imprint, and image. This concerns more specifically mimetic reactions of the audience to events presented most of the time in Gorgias, but not only, mimetically. These three cases, identification, imprint, and image, highlight the passivity of the soul in receiving the impact of the logos which it undergoes. So now identification, 331, identification. The following two passages have been cited earlier, at least in part, but they are well worth recalling here in fully, at least, about identification. Now, so text 2 and text 3, one after the other, on your handout. So 2, identification with the emotions of others. I quote, "Those who hear it," logos, "are penetrated by a terribly fearful shuddering, a much weeping pity, and a yearning that desires grief, and on the basis of the fortune and misfortunes of other people's actions and bodies, their soul is affected by an affection of its own, by the medium of words." End of quote. Text 3, identification based on the nature of the soul. I quote, "The power of speech has the same relation with the arrangement of the soul as the arrangement of drugs has with the nature of bodies." End of quote. So, two aspects are to be highlighted here. First, the identification with the lives of others, primarily with fictional characters from epic and tragic poetry. 2, the analogy between the nature of the soul and that of the body. The emotional reactions to the power of speech would be explained by the constitution of the soul, like the effect of drugs on the constitution of the body. Let us also note here the ambiguity exploited by Gorgias of the term pharmakon, which has two possible meanings. One, remedy, and second, poison. As we know, I was going to say in modern Greek, but perhaps not so explicitly as in ancient Greek. Hence, so it seems, the good and the bad persuasion, referred to earlier. Now imprint, so 332, imprint. Gorgias uses terms derived from the verb typto, typto, 3 times in the encomium. The noun typos or typos primarily means imprint, that which is left by striking. So again, 2 texts in a row, text 4, text 5, text 4 first. Persuasion as imprint, I quote, "And as for the fact that persuasion, joining together with speech, also shapes the soul as it wishes, it is necessary to learn first the arguments of those who study the heavens, who, abolishing and establishing one opinion instead of another, have made things that are unbelievable and unclear appear to the eyes of opinion." End of quote. Text 5, imprint of sight. I quote, "For if it was love, eros, the 4th or 3rd possible cause, that did all this, she, Helen, will be acquitted without difficulty of the accusation of being the cause of the fault being discussed here. For whatever we see does not have the nature that we wish, but the one that each one happens to possess. And by means of sight, the soul is shaped even in its basic ways of being. All translations are, as you notice, at least those here with their handout, from the lax, most lobe edition. In a word, the orator's speech strikes, permeates, and molds the soul, like the deception of fiction, tragic, and epic, like the visual arts, painting and sculpture, which strike the eye and shape the soul. Three, image. While the term mimesis is absent in Gorgias, the related term for image, eikon or ikon, is found there, which implies a form of double. Text 6. Emotional impact of sight. I always give title to the quotation. So I quote, "In this way, fear has extinguished and expelled thought, and many have fallen victim to groundless sufferings, terrible diseases, and incurable madnesses. Thus, sight inscribes within thought the images of things seen. Ikonas or eikonas ton eromenon pragmaton." And then quote. This passage is part of the section on eros, on love. So it is not about logos, persuasion, but about sight, that is, sensory experience. But in both cases, the psychological effect is immediate and tyrannical. In summary, these three aspects of Gorgias's argumentation, that is, identification, imprint, and image, do indeed seem to imply a mimetic theory. A mimetic theory as opposed to that of an autonomous logos, freed from any relation to an external reality, an idea sometimes suggested in the Encomium, which explains why so many readers and commentators defend this reading. One additional argument would be the following. After all, the natural context of logos for Gorgias is judicial and political, a context where popular empiricism prevails, which recognizes sensory perception as a source of knowledge. 3.4. Relationship between opinion and emotion. Thus, as we have seen, Gorgias's conception of logos does appear to imply a certain mimetic relation to reality. Let us inquire a little bit more into this mimetic relation to reality. I try to clarify this somewhat as a beginning through the puzzle about the relation between opinion and emotion. First, I wanted to set the time, but Gorgias insists so much on the power of logos, apparently irresistible, that the reader gets the impression that the audience remains entirely passive in the persuasion process. This is also why we get the impression that emotion for Gorgias is necessarily irrational and that it modifies opinion if it is not directly the cause of it. I propose here the reverse interpretation, the so-called cognitive reading, which is the following: that opinion, that is a form of judgment, causes emotion, at least in the case of logos. So it is not impossible that in the case of sight, the relationship between emotions and opinions is more difficult to determine. Gorgias discusses, I recall, 4 possible causes of Helen's behavior. When he speaks of the will of the gods, physical violence, and eros, he insists on the irresistible force and the passive nature of the behavior. The soul undergoes these external constraints, including passionate love caused notably by the sight of the object, in this case, Paris's body. This is precisely why Helen is innocent. In the case of the power of logos, he also insists, as we have seen, on the passivity of the soul. He does use, as we have seen again, the notion of, or the word related to tipto or typto. But just before doing so, he also states that the soul approves, consents to words and actions. Hence, now, text 7, persuasion and consent. I quote, "For speech that persuades the soul constrains the one, i.e. soul, that it has persuaded both to obey what is said and to approve or consent to what is done." End of quote. So, faced with the power of logos, we are not totally passive. We also play an active role by giving our consent, our approval. But what is this mysterious constraint to which we consent? To what exactly do we consent? What exactly do we approve? In the case of poetry, particularly tragedy, we consent to fiction. We consent to suspend our disbelief momentarily, to use Coleridge's well-known expression. So we consent to fiction to identify with the fictional character, whose feelings we momentarily share through sympathy or empathy. A remark by Gorgias, reported by Plutarch on the glory of the Athenians. This reported remarks confirms this interpretation. Text 8. Text 8, on tragedy, the one who is deceived is wiser or more intelligent. I quote, "A deception, as Gorgias says, in which the one who deceives is more just than the one who does not deceive. And the one who is deceived is more intelligent than the one who is not deceived." End of quote. The one who is deceived is wiser, Plutarch explains immediately, because they are sensitive to the, quote, "the pleasure of words." End of quote. But more generally, we consent by forming an opinion, which causes an emotion, fear, joy, etc. I skip a small section to your benefit. For Gorgias, then, the soul is not completely passive or irrational. Let us see further proofs of this. First, from the beginning of the Encomium, at the beginning, he refers to wisdom, Sophia, as the ornament of the soul. Moreover, Gorgias intends to refute the false accusation made against Helen and thus re-establish justice and truth, as we have seen, by means of reasoning, logismos, and the art, techne, of oratory. Finally, Gorgias refers to physicists and philosophers whose discourse is based notably on reasoning and judgment as well. In short, Gorgias insists on the importance of opinions, that is, representations. How, then, more precisely, do the passive and active dimensions, constraint and consent combine in Gorgias. I think it is something like this. Helen was compelled by Logos to believe that it was preferable to leave her husband and follow Paris. The audience, in turn, appeals to their judgment and is therefore capable, in principle at least, of resisting the power of Logos. And so it is what we could call a consented constraint, as in the case of seduction, which overcomes us. The question is, can we truly resist it? And if so, how? So 3.5, majority versus minority, knowledge versus opinion. It is appropriate here to quote a passage not often commented on, but will be commented by me and by Lassi. On this we agree, and on many other things too. So a passage which is based on the distinction between the majority and the minority, on the distinction between knowledge and opinion. In this passage, Gorgias indirectly states that a minority of human beings is capable of attaining knowledge, which allows them to resist manipulation. So this is our last text, text 9. Credulous majority, sagacious minority. I quote, "For if all human beings, or men, with regard to all things, had memory of the ones that have passed by, understanding of the ones that are present, and forethought for the ones still to come, then a similar speech will not be similarly deceptive. As things are, in fact, at present, insofar as it is easy neither to remember what has passed by, nor to examine what is present, nor to divine what is to come, so that about most things, most people furnish themselves with opinion as a counselor for the soul." Gorgias clearly implies that this minority is capable of resisting manipulation because it possesses knowledge. A knowledge at least sufficient to unmask bad persuasion. Logos, therefore, is not all-powerful because it cannot change the opinion of someone who possesses knowledge. Conclusion. In short, the power of persuasion depends on the type of audience one is dealing with. The power of persuasion, deception, apathy, can be good, as in the case of the aesthetic pleasure found in fiction, but also bad. Bad persuasion is based on ignorance, which is incapable of resisting seduction. In both cases, the notion of mimesis, that is, a relationship between speech and reality, is somehow presupposed. Gorgias's discourse, therefore, aims not only to magnify the power of Logos, but also to signal the dangers of that power, which only the knowledge of a minority can resist. For the propensity of human beings to allow themselves to be deceived leads to, on the one hand, the pleasure of fiction, but also, on the other, to the manipulation in the face of reality. Thank you for your attention. It was a bit long. We thought that we would keep questions for afterwards, after Lassi's own paper.
I think I do. François, can I ask you up over your head? You said like that, but I think so. I didn't print enough of them, but actually my slides have all the quotations. So I prepared both a handout for those who are present here and a slide presentation which has only the quotations which I cite for those who follow via the live broadcast. Thank you, François. I can't imagine a better introduction for this because you did all the dialectical stuff, went through all the problems and so on. And now I'm going to pursue quite single-mindedly one particular path into the Encomium of Helen. But I just noticed that we really agree on the most things. So I think we have two cognitivist perspectives to Gorgias today. And but I think it is true that we are kind of opposing a trend of reading Gorgias, which has been quite dominant from the 80s on. So Gorgias' Encomium of Helen contains, as we noticed, one of the earliest systematic, or at least semi-systematic, accounts of the notoriously multifaceted and highly important concept of logos. Despite the fact that the explicit topic of the speech, as François pointed out, is the mythological Helen of Sparta and the possible causes of her trip to Troy with Paris, incidentally, this was a very common topic in the late 5th century BCE, and we have many dramas of Euripides who deal with the same mythical stuff. Anyway, the actual topic, or so we could argue, of Helen's encomium is really the nature of speech, for this section takes more than half of the whole speech. So, despite having been given in a rather strange format as a kind of excursion within a showcase speech, Gorgias' sketch on what logos is and how it operates seems to be highly and astonishingly systematic, especially given that we are here talking about the 5th century BCE source, which usually do not put much weight on terminological accuracy and consistency. In this talk, my intention is to discuss one strand of Gorgias' theory and one strand of the encomium, a strand that we might dub cognitive and epistemological. This means that I will brush aside many of those problematic, interesting aspects which François mentioned, emotions, will, and also the highly interesting stylistical features of Gorgias' prose. I will focus strictly on Gorgias' analysis of doxa, which I will translate as opinion, and its relation to both logos, which I translate both as speech and as language, and to being or to reality, to einai or ta onta. So this mimetic dimension which François brought in plays a role in my talk, even though I had not used this terminology of mimesis in my talk. One point that I would like to show is that Gorgias' discussion concerning this complex is thoroughly epistemologically colored, as it is based on reflections on the limits of human knowledge. So I will start from select passages in Helen and proceed them also to some fragmentarily preserved texts, which seem to provide further support for my reading, or perhaps our reading. So let us start from text 1, a passage which starts and sets the tone for Gorgias' discussion concerning logos. Speech is a powerful lord. So this is text 1 on the handout. With the smallest and most invisible body, it accomplishes godlike deeds. It can put a stop to fear, remove pain, produce joy, and to make compassion grow. That this is the case, I shall demonstrate. With this characterization, Gorgias articulates logos as an active or dynamic factor which affects and changes the psychological constitution, the states and dispositions of the human being. The examples given here in this passage concern emotions like fear, joy, and pain, not beliefs or cognitive contents. I should like to note that it is fairly clear that Gorgias certainly did not commit what J.L. Austin in the 20th century called the descriptive fallacy concerning language, namely the fallacy that the only or main business of language is to describe facts. On the contrary, Gorgias stressed that language has many modi of operandi, modes of operation, and affecting the hearer's emotions is among the central ones. So this we have to bear in mind. But still, I would like to suggest that an important strand of Gorgias' argument in Helen does in fact concern opinions and cognitive contents. For is not the very common belief that Helen and Helen alone was guilty for the Trojan War a conception which Gorgias sets to refute in his speech, a case in point? It is a belief which is truth apt, so to say. It can be true or false. Indeed, in his speech, Gorgias uses fairly systematically the term doxa, in particular in singular, opinion or conception, to refer to such cognitive and truth-apt beliefs or opinions. Now, besides delivering several examples of how speech affects human souls, Gorgias also gives us an argument or reason why the human soul is so easily affected by language. And now we come actually to text 2, which was quoted by François. I quote, "How many have persuaded and persuade how many others in how many issues by shaping or compiling a deceitful speech? If everyone had memory of all things past, insight into things present, and foresight into all things to come, speech would not be the same in the same manner. But now remembering the past, considering the present, and predicting the future is not an easy task. And so, in most cases, most of us provide our souls with the counsel of opinion, doxa. But opinion, slippery and uncertain as it is, surrounds the ones using it with slippery and uncertain successes." My proposal is that this passage, also quoted by François, is the most important argumentative passage in Gorgias' characterization of logos and its relation to the human soul. So let us focus on some of the passages. So I have separated the passages by A, B1, B2, C, and C2. So while the passage A mainly reiterates the earlier point about speech as a powerful lord, it adds the dimension that our relation to language is, according to Gorgias, simultaneously active and passive. We are subjected to the power of speech, yes, but the speech is also at our disposal. It is something that we can shape, mold, or compile. The Greek word used here is plasso. So perhaps a speaker can master the logos, which is the great Lord. So the speaker becomes here the kind of one who masters the master. More interesting, in my view, is, however, passage B. I quote it again. "If everyone had memory of all things past, insight into all things present, and foresight into all things to come, speech would not be the same in the same manner. But now remembering the past, considering the present, and predicting the future is not an easy task." This passage contains a counterfactual thought experiment and an explanation for the fact that language is a great potentiate or lord. Here Gorgias establishes a connection between epistemology, or rather the epistemic limitations that characterize our abilities to have insight into past, present and future, and the power of speech. His idea is that if we were different, if we were not limited in the ways we are limited, speech would not have the power that it factually has. This seems to be the sense of the rather difficult formulation, uk an homoios en ho logos. Here it is perhaps worth mentioning that with his reference to the past, present and future, Gorgias seems to be alluding to a fairly common topos of which was used to mark the wisdom of sages in earlier Greek literature. In Iliad 1:70, for example, the sage Kalchas is designed as someone who knew the past, the present and future. So here Gorgias is playing somehow with the Greek intellectual tradition. Now if we move to the passage C, so I quote again, "And so in most cases most of us provide us our soul with the counsel of opinion. But opinion, slippery and uncertain as it is, surrounds the one using it with slippery and uncertain success." Here Gorgias introduces a further idea, that our limited access to the facts makes it necessary for most of us, in most cases, to provide our souls with the counsel of opinion, of doxa. In other words, our actions are not guided by certain insights into facts, but by opinions. And since opinions can be, as Gorgias says, slippery and uncertain, often they are false, they allegedly open up the path for the persuasive power of speech. And while this close connection between logos, speech, and doxa is not explicitly mentioned in this passage, it is referred to some lines later when Gorgias gives some examples on the persuasive power of language. And now we come to text number 3. I will only read the bold section. "That persuasion, he peitho, being present in the speech, impressed the soul as it wanted, must be learned, first from the speeches of the astronomers, who, by replacing an opinion with another, taking the former away and producing the latter, make incredible and obscure things appear to the eye of opinion." This passage makes it patently clear that for Gorgias, one of the central psychic constellations that the speeches manipulate is that of our opinions, doxa. Speeches bring about new opinions and make us abandon old ones. Here I would like to direct your attention to a peculiar analogy which appears here and also at different places in Gorgias' fragments. We may call this the sensual analogy of opinion. In this passage, Gorgias claims that speech makes incredible and obscure things appear to the eye of opinion. Now, if we take this analogy seriously, the point is that by means of speech and opinion, we can, as it were, have access precisely to those things that we can't know, past things, present things that are far away from us, and future things. So speech and opinion and their eyes kind of open our vision beyond the horizon, which is our immediate perceptual space. Thus, when Gorgias talks about doxa, it seems that he has in mind, on the one hand, beliefs, like singular beliefs. This is often, like in this passage, he uses the singular form, replacing one doxa with another. But on the other hand, he also speaks about doxa as a kind of faculty to beliefs. So not only particular beliefs, but a faculty to have this kind of cognitive beliefs. And this faculty, he seems he understood in analogy with the perceptual faculty. There is, however, a crucial point where the analogy between perception and opinion breaks down. When we see something with our eyes, what we see is typically really there. It's determined by the facts. Senses, as we would say today, are veridical. But speech and our opinion are not. Incidentally, this difference was noted and stressed by Gorgias himself in a fragment from another work. This is text number 4. I like this. For when somebody thinks of a flying man or a chariot running on the sea, there neither suddenly flies a man nor runs a chariot on the sea, and hence things we think are not things that are. In other words, there is no inference from thought to is. Being in or from context of opinion or thought to being. So both speech and opinion are characterized by the relative independence from being and facts. For Gorgias, the two, speech and opinion, logos and doxa, are very closely related, and they are, as it were, two sides of the same coin. So for Gorgias, speech is the medium for changing the doxa, and doxa is this kind of semi-perceptual faculty, which, however, unlike perception, is not veridical. So this passage was from the treatise on non-being, and it is not the only fragment of Gorgias that can be used to illuminate and supplement the theory that I have tried to extract from Helen. In what follows now, I will present a selection of further such passages. So let us begin with a very short fragment in which the relation between dokein or doxa, as we have it in Helen, and the being to einai is thematized. The fragment I have in mind is the Diels and Kranz fragment number 26, text 5 on the handout. I quote, "Being is invisible when opinion meets it not, and opinion is weak when being meets it not." The fragment thematises the possible meeting point of opinion or being, or alternatively, the lack of it. This meeting is expressed here in fairly cautious terms as something like coincidental hitting upon, dikon in Greek from the verb dynchano. But on the other hand, Gorgias seems in principle to accept some kind of correspondence or possibility of the meeting of opinions and being. If we play a little bit with the fragment and remove the negative, it seems that the positive case where the meeting occurs, being becomes in a way visible to the eyes of our opinion. It is no longer invisible or aphanes. Note here the visual analogy of doxa, which we mentioned earlier. And simultaneously, opinion, as if it were, becomes strong. It is no longer asthenes, as if strengthened by the being itself. I note that this interpretation hinges on interpreting the participial construction here in conditional and not in causal sense, but that would be my suggestion. In this fragment, nothing is said of the means of establishing this meeting point between opinion and being. But we do luckily already know what this intermediating link would be. It would be, of course, logos, which as we just saw, is characterized in Helen as the medium by means of which things can be made visible to the eyes of the opinion. Now, let us move on to another fragment. As I noted earlier, Gorgias' theory of knowledge, as it appears in Helen, is characterized by his focus on the limits of our power to know things. He did not, however, at least in the speeches, reject completely the possibility of knowing something. In fact, Gorgias' second preserved speech, The Defence of Palamedes, provides us with further important clues on Gorgias' positive epistemology. Defence of Palamedes is based on another well-known mythical topos. According to this given story, Odysseus had accused Palamedes for high treason during the Trojan War, and Gorgias' speech is another showcase speech, a kind of fictional apology of the falsely accused hero. It is given in the voice of Palamedes. In one passage of the speech, directed to Odysseus, Palamedes raises a question concerning the epistemic status of Odysseus' accusations. This is text 6. He asks, "Is your accusation based on accurate knowledge or on opinion? If on knowledge, then you have come to know either by having seen, having participated, or having learned it from somebody who participated." So here we have nothing less than a tripartite taxonomic definition of what it is to have knowledge, what it is to eidenai agribos. The paradigm case is here that of seeing and doing oneself, the first person case as it were. The third case is a mediated case, a third person case, which should be somehow reducible to the paradigm case of being a witness to something taking place. However, this mediated case involves the use of witnesses and trusting their testimonies. And then, so this would be in Gorgias' way some cases of knowing. Perhaps eidos agrivos, which is used here, would be the case of the perceptual awareness of participating, and I don't know if he would use the agrivos term for the mediated case. In any case, in the context of Palamedes, these would be the cases of knowing, and if none of these apply, there is only opinion, doxa only. So if we trust this to be, let's say, a doctrine of Gorgias, it seems that, like his fellow sophist Protagoras, Gorgias took sense perception to constitute the main paradigm of knowledge. And I think here this mediated case is highly interesting. So the mediated case involves real knowledge by somebody and the mediation of this knowledge to other by means of logos or speech. So that was the perspective from Palamedes. Now, dear audience, I am at the point in my speech where I thought to round up things very smoothly and go to the ending, which would make my presentation a nice whole. However, since this topic was something that was the thing about drugs and the analogy between the drugs and speech, because François so nicely already talked about this, I will now improvise a bit and instead pursue another argument, which is which I have found from the earlier treatise from non-being. So let's have a look at that. So at this point, a critical pause is due, for I have here tried to articulate a kind of fairly positive epistemology in Gorgias based on the idea of a perception as a paradigm case of knowledge, which can then be mediated by means of logos, and then we have some kind of correspondence between opinions and beings. So this sounds pretty much empiricism to me. However, concerning Gorgias, we have the great difficulty that he also had this earlier treatise called On Non-Being, which actually has the rather grandiose first thesis presented against the theory of Parmenides, and this thesis is nothing is. The second thesis is if something is, it may not be known. And the third thesis is, if something is and may be known, it cannot be communicated to others. So it seems that, giving an interpretation of this treatise is very crucial for my interpretation of Gorgias' speeches. Because I have taken for granted some kind of correspondence between being and opinion or thought, and the possibility of transmitting opinions to others by means of logos. To put things very crudely, my reading would be that Gorgias' treatise's first and second step are primarily directed against the logic of Parmenides and constitute something like a reductio absurdum of the Eleatic logic. But especially on the second and third step of Gorgias' argument, Gorgias uses many arguments concerning, say, the nature of sense perception and the communicability of opinions that can be made, I hope, compatible with my interpretation of Helen. So without pursuing further with this general interpretive framework of this treatise, I will now present you one passage which I think is highly interesting, and it is rarely discussed in the literature. So this passage is actually an early passage on the emergence of language, and it appears in the Sextus paraphrase of on non-being. So I quote, "But the speech," Gorgias says, "is formed out of the things that fall upon us from outside, that is, from the objects of the senses." Ton aiste ton in Greek. So, from the encounter with Jews, a speech expression corresponding to this quality springs up in us, and from falling of a color, that corresponding to the color. But if things stand like this, the speech is not a representation of the external, but the external becomes the interpretation of the speech. So in Greek this would be Uk hologos tu ektos parastatikos estin, alla to ektos tu logu menytikon kiinetai. This is a very difficult passage, and I'm quite puzzled about how to interpret here the parastatikos and menytikon, and we'll see about that in a while. Anyway, the interesting thing about this passage is that if it represents Gorgias' position, he actually was an empiricist about the language acquisition too. So language, or the elements of language here, come from the sensible things. So from sensual encounters with our surroundings, expressions emerge to mark the things we see, hear, taste, and touch. And concerning the final passage, final sentence here, I propose a rather simple reading. When Gorgias says that logos is not a parastatikos of the external, and that the external is the menytikon of logos, he merely stresses what I have previously referred to as the kind of independence of logos from being. Actually, I skipped that part partly, but anyway. So, according to this passage, language and being touch each other, but only when speech is first, when speech first emerges. Afterwards, when we have the names for things which come from the sensual perception, we have the elements for logos which we can combine quite freely, and these do not correspond to being in the same way. So this would be my interpretation for Gorgias' claim that speech is not a representation, something, or parastatikos, something that stands by the being. The other half was that the external becomes the menytikon of logos, which I translated that the external becomes the interpretation of the speech. So more or less we would have here what François called the mimesis somehow of the external. So because of this touch, because of the us having the elements of speech, they kind of represent the external, but you can't infer the external from language. So I think here Gorgias is more or less arguing against the identity of logos and being, which would be a kind of Parmenidean idea, and instead proposing something that he did not have terms for, which would be a referential relation between language and the sensibles. So this was a bit rumbling now, but I wanted to cover some fresh waters instead of just rounding up my talk concerning Helen with my with remarks on the pharmacon idea of nature of logos. So anyway, to finish here, one could say that the basic point of my talk has been this. For Gorgias, logos or speech is neither only a tool for misleading people or a medium that works entirely on emotions. Speech is also concerned with cognitive states of belief and opinion. And furthermore, Gorgias had some kind of idea of opinion as a faculty of human being, which concerns cognitive contents. Furthermore, according to Gorgias, speech is also the only medium through which human beings, limited as they are in their cognitive capacities, may establish a contact with being that is outside the realms of our present surroundings. So my reading of doxa and logos in Gorgias is very much a positive one, unlike many who think that Gorgias had an exclusively negative idea of doxa. So thank you very much, and sorry for the somewhat improvisational excursion on non-being. Thank you. So we will now move on to the discussion part of the evening. And since we have the live broadcast in YouTube, it would be advisable that those of you who ask the questions use the microphone so that the people following online can hear us. And we will both be here in front, and we'll see how this trialogue between François, me, and the audience will proceed.
You mentioned earlier that Gorgias was aware of Hippocratic findings. To what extent Gorgias' way of presenting all these things are conditioned by Hippocratic thought?
So that question is probably to me, because I mentioned the Hippocratic thought.
Because, excuse me for a moment, Hippocratic thought implied that speech and emotions reside in the brain. And the issue of soul is maybe irrelevant for Hippocratic thought.
Yes, yes.
So in that sense, why is he using the term soul, the term speech, the term emotions, as if they're separate things?
That is a very good question, indeed. I think it's quite obvious from some passages in Helen that Gorgias was very well informed by the Hippocratic corpus. This is evident in the way he also uses some terms like dynamis and soma. So he's very much part of these conceptual changes that take place in these very basic philosophical concepts like those of body and those of soma. And in some Hippocratic writings, of course, we had the idea of explaining the a phenomenon of health and disease by means of these bodily fluids and their manipulation. This passage, which also François quoted, shows that Gorgias saw a strict analogy between the different kinds of speeches given to somebody's soul or body and the way the medicines or different fluids that are given as medicine affect the condition of the body. The question about the soul and body is more difficult because to some extent it is possible to read Gorgias as a materialist in the sense that he may have followed Empedocles in viewing sense perception as a completely physiological process by means of the streams of perceptible particles that somehow fit the channels in the body. So you can actually articulate sense perception on a purely materialistic level. And because Gorgias also sees an analogy between the doxa and the sense perception, perhaps this can be generalized to the other faculties of soul too. But of course, what words you use, if you use the word body and soul, it doesn't mean that you could not somehow reduce the soul to bodily features. So that would be my quick answer to that. Does François has something to add here?
Can you hear me? Yes, no. Yeah, very excellent question, and indeed a difficult one. Part of the answer is probably located in that very transitory period to which Gorgias belongs, so to speak. The use of psyche, soul, probably is not as problematic for them as it may sound to us, because psyche for us has a long metaphysical, theological tradition where the soul is immaterial by definition, whereas for the Greeks, even in Homer, it's not so clear what the status of the soul in as its relation to the body. In Homer, we know that there's an afterlife, but it's a shadowy one, so then again. But thank you, it's something we have to think about, indeed. By the way, Jonathan, can people online participate to the discussion? No, I don't think so. They don't. So now, Anna Tijani, a question.
Thank you, Lassi and François, for these two stimulating speeches on such fascinating texts. The question is the following, especially about Eleni's Encomium. I think that you both agree that we can detect in this, we can find in this text some kind of theory of knowledge that we can say that it's Gorgias' theory of knowledge. Is this right? Let's start from that. If this is right, then the question is, can we set aside that this text is the product of the technique of a rhetorician, of rhetoric, and as a good rhetorician needs to use common beliefs, common places that everyone would accept. And in this case, saying that it's true, I've seen it with my own eyes, it's just something that many people would accept, not something that someone who uses it in a speech for persuading others would accept. I mean, for example, a rhetorician would find a lot of arguments against someone who says, we have an eyewitness of a murder, so there's no need for discussion. We know. There are is perception. Someone had perception of the murder, so truth is there, no argument is needed. I mean, how can we forget that it's not a treatise that Gorgias writes when he writes the Encomium? So this is the question. Thank you.
Yeah, because of courtesy and politeness, I give you the responsibility of answering to this other difficult question.
Anna, that was an excellent question. Thank you so much for that. I mean, that is a real problem with these two speeches by Gorgias, because, I mean, even their categorization as speeches is difficult because, I mean, it predates Aristotle's division into different genres of speech, and it's also unclear what the function of this speech was. It is typically said that it's a showcase piece which he may have either given to attract students or to amuse crowds in the theater. It is sometimes said that the Gorgias had the tendency of giving speeches in the theater of Dionysus in Athens, and he would ask people to give topics, and then we would give extemporate speeches for that. I mean, yes, he was very much experimenting with these speeches. And I think also that in this speech, Gorgias does use a lot of commonplaces in let's say, what Aristotle would call endoxa. Yes. And of course, he's challenging one big endoxa too, which would be the what people think about Helen. And perhaps, yes, you could say that one endoxa is also the fact that language affects people, which I mentioned in my quotation number 2. So I can't really say that there's a definite argument for taking this speech to be informed by something like Gorgias' epistemology. What strikes me as quite surprising is that it seems that if we try to work out how Gorgias uses these terms and connect them to other fragments, it is an astonishingly coherent picture. And so I think this argument from cohesion would be a path that I would follow in answering your question. But this is a big problem, but unfortunately all the originals we have from Gorgias, so to say, are these showcase speeches.
Just to add something, yeah, it is another very good question about the kind of writing that is, and its status, scientific, literary. It's an epidectic speech which contains theoretical elements, and the two extremes, as we've referred to those readings, that is, either it can be seen as just as oratory, or the other extreme, it's like a treatise-like, or just a speech. And I think, so far in my early studies of Gorgias, I think it's a mixed bag, because after all, its very structure is a bit awkward. We have both mythical and argumentative elements. We have a section in the middle, about from 8 to 14, about the logos. From 14 to 19 about love. This creates an imbalance in the speech, and that's why it's so difficult to know how to approach it, because it does contain those elements. Besides, it's interesting how the commonsensical dimension is made explicit. For instance, at the beginning, when he says about the first cause, that is divine power, he says, of course, it is known that gods, by definition, are superior to humans. Well, does it mean that Gorgias believes in the myths of his time, or is just referring to the audience's own belief? That, again, is a problem. So So is that he appeals to commonsensical notions of knowledge, also because, as I referred to perhaps too briefly, the context for him most of the time is political or judicial. So a good question we have to think about further. Thank you. Stelios, I think, has a question.
Thank you very, very much, both of you, for this splendid for your splendid lectures. Yes, thank you very much.
No, Stelios can let's have again. So, yeah, sorry, I just said, I told François that Xantippe also asked, so please go on, yeah. Please go on.
So thank you very much for your beautiful lectures. I would just like to challenge some of your thoughts. It seems that we are condemned to use modern and elaborated distinctions.
Does your microphone work?
Yes, can you hear me?
It's better.
It seems we are in a situation that we use very fine distinctions in order to analyze Gorgias, where he belongs to an era that those distinctions were in the making. So if it is a forensic speech trying to acquit Helen, and we could start from that, he uses praise in order to acquit. So that would be epidectic and forensic together. But in the beginning he talks about what a good city should praise, what is praiseworthy, and not blame what is praiseworthy, and vice versa. It should, in a city, men should not blame what is praiseworthy and praise what is to be blamed. So, in a sense, he transgresses the genres of rhetorical speeches. But having said that, and coming to your interpretation, François, there is a topos in Quintilian Institutio Oratoria pro omaton ante oculos, to bring something before one's eyes arouses feelings that make the body shake and tremble. So that is, there you have a rhetorical technique that goes directly at the idea of mimesis. But again, if you don't understand that as acquitting Helen, you cannot understand why he chooses to soothe the feelings, because he has φόβον παύσε, λύπην αφελήν, χαράν ενεργάστε, έλεον επαυξήσε. He selects only the soothing functions, adoucir le mœurs, in order to acquit Helen. And coming back to Lassi's, so that's one point I would like you to comment on. And coming back to Lassi's lecture, he has a claim for truth. I would start there to understand the epistemological status of, or his epistemological motives behind this speech, because he says, ελέγξε τους ψευδομένους. That means ελέγξε, which is to refute and show people that are lying for Helen. So that is his claim. He starts by saying that I will restore truth. So there you have a very bold epistemological claim to acquit Helen. And the final point, third point and last, what do you make of the last sentence? Elenis men egomion emon the pegnion. If you cannot account for that, both your interpretations are missing something very important that gives a new meaning to the whole argumentation. And a thing about Anna mentioned, if it is a treatise or not, it's strange because you have a catalog of arguments that would all acquit an orator would only need one of those topos, the gods, or a man with superior strength, or eros, or being persuaded. He would only use one. To put and name all the possible topos for acquitting is like giving a treatise that must have the totality of arguments disposable to the orator in order to acquit someone, which brings us to the epistemological claim of a techne, that it must have all the topos available, the topi available in order to acquit. Thank you, and sorry for...
Thank you so much. I think the first question was addressed to you, François, so would you like to be in?
Stelios, thank you. I'm not sure I understood the last part of your of your first comment, because actually I couldn't quite follow the quotation you were reading from Lassi's handout, which I didn't have with me. As for the first part of it, you said that, as he does at the beginning, he distinguishes between a speech that blames or praises on the one hand, which would not be compatible with the other action, which was, you said, not blaming, not praising, but oh, sorry, you don't have the you don't have the microphone anymore.
He says that in a city, men should not praise what is disgraceful, and should not blame what is praised.
The contrary, yeah.
The contrary, what must be praised. So I will restore the order of things by praising what is praiseworthy, and show that you are lying against Helen.
And did you say you saw a problem or breaking a rule in this by Gorgias?
That is his quote, he states his cause. So I think you should take that into account in order to understand how he uses emotions. You refer to mimesis, which is one of the most important aspects of mimesis, is to bring fear, to instill fear, and to raise pity. So he uses only the emotions that would soothe those feelings, fear and augment pity. So he uses only one aspect, one side of the positive feelings that would go towards acquitting Helen.
Yes, but still, I'm not sure if I can, if I agree, but I'm not sure. Perhaps I misunderstand your point. But are there not two different sections of the speech? That is, there are, as I tried to clarify at the beginning, he wants to exonerate Helen. He wants to show that she has been condemned unjustly, that the blame against her was that she does not deserve that blame, and that blame is misguided. But after that, then he goes into the power of logos, capable of creating all those emotions in the audience, so that I'm not sure if you can link the two as you do, because I think they're not quite at the same level, so to speak. One is, so to speak, the practical aim of defending Helen. The other is another kind of praise. He doesn't praise Helen. He defends Helen. That's one of the points of High Socrates later on. But as for the logos, as to the power of logos, it is a matter of, one could say, praising the logos, but trying to show how powerful it is. So it's interesting to think about it that way. Someone could say that he wants to destroy the blame against Helen, to defend Helen, while also at another level, more theoretical, to praise, so to speak, praise the power of Logos. But I don't think it was exactly your point, but in other words, I'm not sure we can bring them exactly at the same level. But thank you, something to think about too. Did you want to add something before Xantip intervenes?
Steli has had in a way 3 different questions, and I think I can address here, well, because you actually referred to this passage, which would have been the proper ending of my talk had I not pursued on this sail on the open sea of non-being instead. So Gorgias wrote at the beginning of the talk, he says that his aim is, by offering some reasoning, it is, by the way, the word logismon, which is quite astonishing, by means of my speech, 1, to absolve the badly accused Helen from blame, 2, to reveal the ones who blame her as liars, 3, to show the truth, and 4, to put a stop to ignorance. I mean, it's part of this, like, Gorgias as a reader thinks that you can't really just praise Helen, because the praise won't work if Helen is considered guilty. So you also need to work on the apology side in this speech in order to free the path for the praise part of the speech. So he's doing so many things at the same time in this speech. One thing which I think, what I wanted to say at the end of my speech is that for Gorgias, a speech which aims at the truth never consists just of stating what is true, because you really have to fight the ignorance of others and, so to say, enter into argumentative agon with the contesting beliefs. And I think this is also something that is very much worth remembering today in our world, where I think this kind of open argument with opposing positions is missing.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your very enlightening talks. And I think you managed to bring new light to texts that have been discussed a lot, not all of them, though. And somehow you made the case, if I understand, against the tradition of wanting Gorgias to have a divorce between reality and speech, and also to deny somehow the possibility of knowledge. So I think you managed to persuade me, at least, that Gorgias cares for truth and for knowledge, and also that there is a connection between speech and reality, despite, I think both you wanted to establish such a connection, if I understood well, despite the impression that the treatise Peritou Ontos gives. But I'm not so sure that you managed to fully establish the connection between speech, logos, and truth. So I'm thinking of 2 passages, 2 issues. One is concerns more François, and it concerns the issue of imitation. So if we think that the speech is imitation of reality, of course there must be a connection with reality. But what kind of connection is this? Is it, and what kind of imitation it is? For example, Plato in the Sophists distinguishes between 2 types of imitation. One which is deceptive and gives the deceptive image which somehow substitutes the original, and a true image which is correct in relation to original. So Gorgias' account of perception, I think, corresponds to the, let's say, good or correct type of image, because we see in the passage you quoted a kind of direct relation between the soul and the experience, this kind of printing, directly printing. And this fits with the empiricism of Gorgias. But what about speech? Is there such a relation? It's, I think, at best an indirect relation. So speech somehow imitates our experience and gives the deceptive feeling of reality without somehow properly corresponding to reality. Perhaps I'm saying that as a possibility. And the second goes to the passage, a very, very interesting passage that Lassi quoted about the cause or origin of speech. So I don't know whether this is how I understand this passage. It says that somehow the speech is caused by reality or by experiences. But what it seems to forbid by saying λόγος του εκτός παραστατικός εστιν is that logos can represent reality in such a way that we can somehow investigate through logos reality. So it's not through logos that we can search for reality. Rather, it is, if we already know truth, we can understand logos. So somehow, logos cannot be a tool for truth, perhaps, or at least it gives this idea. And then maybe Plato could be at least right in that Gorgias doesn't seem to care a lot for truth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Again, I suppose the first is addressed to me, so I cannot avoid it. Huh? That's right. And you have
you
to
can't
answer
avoid
afterwards.
it, François.
May I ask you to which text you were actually referring? In my
The text you quoted, the 3:3, implicit mimesis in the encomium. So it's text.
So the image.
Yes, 3, 4, and 5.
So that would correspond to text 6, I think. At least that's where he uses the word image,
yes,
icon.
6, yes.
Thus, sight inscribes within thought the images of things seen. You were thinking, among other things, of that passage, or?
Yes, this is also relevant because somehow speech also gives, in the eyes of doxa, images, but these may be imitations of imitations somehow.
Imitations of imitation. Tell me, when you use doxa yourself, are you thinking of Gorgias's twofold meaning of doxa? Doxa has this usual sense of opinion, but also the state of mind, so to speak, of the person having that doxa. Because he seems to be using doxa in both senses, but so according to the context. So in the first case, that is doxa, a representation of an object. Your question is, in what way is the object the referent of that mental image?
Maybe I can ask again, in what way you understand the speech as an imitation of reality? Is it the imitation that comes from a direct relation or some sort of indirect relation, which also may lead to some fake reality, let's say?
Well, in both cases, because you refer to the Platonic distinction between falsehood and truth. In the case of Gorgias, we have to work with often statements that are not so explicit. So we derive, I did in some respects, a position that is only implied in the way he expresses himself. So, for instance, when he says that there are errors of the mind, or that the accusation is false, it doesn't say in what way it is false, except in its explanatory power. That is, it does not explain correctly why Helen behaved the way she did. In this case, that her will was compromised by the power of logos. And as a result, thinking that she should be blamed, it is a false accusation because it doesn't correspond to truth, and doesn't correspond to truth because it doesn't correspond to the four, apparently systematic, complete list of the possible causes. But in my way of using the word implied or implications, I meant that not all, but in many cases, we can only derive a position from statements that are not part of an explicit position. So that when he says that something is false, we must assume that he assumes that there is something as the truth. Nothing, if we talk about something false, is because there must be something, it's contrary, it's faultness.
And where truth in logos comes from? And where does truth come from? I mean, the capacity of logos to reach truth.
Yeah, the challenge of your question, I would say, is, okay, are we dealing here with what is called traditionally a corresponding or correspondence theory of truth or not? My way of using the mimesis concept goes in that direction, although I acknowledge that there are not so many elements, but there are enough, I think, to assume that this is implied. But to flesh out his explicit position is very difficult, perhaps impossible. But thank you for your question.
Yes,
other was
I think our time is almost up, so I will be very brief in addressing this thing. So this may be a bit too precise even, but I think Gorgias, both the coherence and correspondence theory have a place in Gorgias. And this passage on the emergence of speech shows that these speech expressions, he uses kata something logos, or something corresponding or being accordance to the juices. There's a logos according to those juices. There's a touching point, let's say, with names and expressions. And this allows the possibility of some kind of correspondence between the elements of speech and between being. So we have correspondence. But then on the other hand, there's this coherence thing that you need to take into account, not just the statement of true facts, but to work through the whole context where people form their opinions in order for the truth to be somehow enforced. So you need to remove the obstacles from getting the truth in order to show the truth in speech. So this way he combines the coherence and correspondence approaches, I would say. But we can continue on this on the roof terrace of the Canadian Institute, where I have here, there will be some
maybe a very last question from Nikos. Nikos Ratis. Yeah, it does work, but you have to wait some time, 2 or 3 seconds. You have to see the light. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, both of you, for your very good presentations. About Xanthippis' question for the relation of logos to reality, to truth. There is a paragraph, a passage from Helen's Encomium that speaks about painters. So, maybe there is some kind of a relation like art, like painting, imitates reality. Logos imitates reality, imitates images of reality maybe, but as we know, art has freedom to represent reality. There are degrees of freedom. There can be precise representations, but also more free representations. So maybe there is a link between painting and rhetoric and language, logos. And another point I would like to make, another comment, it's that we didn't mention the pre-Socratics, Parmenides, Heraclitus. I think that we will not understand Gorgias if we don't go to Parmenides, to Heraclitus, to Empedocles, especially Parmenides. I think he's a central figure for his thought. Thank you.
I agree with everything you say. Concerning the pictorial representation, I am reminded of what Wittgenstein said in his early work sometimes, that language is a pictorial representation, but it is a very abstracted one where there's only the logical representation left. So you can abstract from pictures and then you simply have names corresponding to objects. So I think you can kind of push that analogy and keep the mimesis inside with the language. Yeah.
Nothing to add except to invite people to.
Yeah.
So we are all invited to refreshments on the top, on the roof now. So there is wine and all kinds of little interesting things for all. Thank you again.